At 9:15 in the morning, Donald Trump signed an executive order and believed he had just won. By Thursday evening, he would understand, or perhaps still hasn't understood, that the war he declared had already been lost before he picked up his pen, not because Canada was stronger, not because the retaliation was fiercer, but because the man sitting in Ottawa had spent 11 months building the architecture of a victory that required exactly one thing to be revealed: Donald Trump doing precisely what Donald Trump always does. The executive order was signed at 9:15 in the morning, Oval Office, cameras rolling. Trump stood surrounded by trade advisors, all of them carrying the practiced solemnity of people who believed they were witnessing history. And in a narrow technical sense they were. No American president has ever designated an allied nation. America's largest trading partner, the country sharing the longest undefended border on earth, as a strategic economic adversary. That phrase carries legal weight. It triggers sanctions authorities. It activates regulatory mechanisms designed for hostile states. It places Canada, functionally and formally, in the same legal category as Iran, North Korea, and China. The specifics were staggering. 50% blanket tariffs on every Canadian product entering the United States. Not targeted, not sector-specific, blanket. Every product, every industry, every shipment crossing a border that 9 million people cross every month for work, family, and commerce. Key provisions of the USMCA. The agreement governing nearly $2 trillion in annual North American trade. Suspended. The Treasury Department directed to restrict Canadian institutional access to American financial clearing systems. Every pending cross-border infrastructure project frozen. Pipelines, bridges, transmission lines, everything. And the Department of Homeland Security ordered to treat the Canadian border with the same security posture reserved for hostile frontiers. Trump delivered a 22-minute Rose Garden address with the energy of a man who believed he was reshaping the Continental Order. He was combative, triumphal, almost giddy. He attacked Mark Carney personally, called him a failed central banker who got lucky, the worst leader Canada had ever produced. He claimed Canada had been stealing American jobs and laughing behind America's back for decades. He told the cameras that Canada's economy was nothing without the United States, and that Carney would be begging for a meeting within 48 hours. And then he looked directly into the lens and delivered the line that would echo through every phase of what came next. They want to test me. Let them. Nobody wins a fight against the United States of America. Nobody. In Ottawa, in a quiet office on Parliament Hill, a folder marked Scenario Maximum was opened for the first time. Not because anyone was surprised, because they had been waiting. The markets reacted within minutes. The Dow Jones shed 720 points in the first hour of trading, the sharpest single morning decline triggered by a presidential policy action in over a decade. Auto sector stocks cratered. GM fell 9%. Ford dropped 11%. The hundreds of smaller parts suppliers that form the backbone of North American manufacturing lost even more. Energy stocks collapsed as traders calculated the chaos of a 50% tariff on the nation that supplies the majority of America's imported crude oil. CEOs of major American corporations began calling the White House, not to congratulate, but to plead. GM, Ford, and Stellantis issued an emergency joint statement within 90 minutes. Tariffs at this level would force suspension of North American manufacturing operations within weeks. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce called it the most damaging economic action taken by a U.S. president against an allied nation in living memory. And then something happened that nobody in the White House anticipated. The Canadian dollar dropped initially. That was expected, but then it stabilized, and then it began to rise. International investors were watching, and they were not betting on Trump. They were betting on Canada. Markets don't move on hope. Markets move on information. And somewhere, someone had information. For 24 hours after Trump's announcement, Ottawa maintained absolute silence. No official response. No diplomatic communication. No statement of any kind. Washington reporters described it as either paralysis or capitulation, depending on the outlet. White House aides were emboldened. Trump reportedly told advisers that evening that Carney was done, that the silence proved Canada had no leverage, no options, that this would be over within a week. But inside Ottawa, insiders told a different story entirely. Carney was not in shock. He was not scrambling. He was in his office with 3 senior advisers and a stack of briefing documents that had been finalized weeks earlier. During those 24 hours of public silence, phone calls were being placed to Brussels, Tokyo, London, Canberra, and Seoul. Agreements drafted months before were receiving final signatures. Infrastructure commitments classified as under review were being activated. Energy contracts that had been in discussion for nearly a year were being closed and countersigned. The silence wasn't fear. The silence was execution. Washington saw quiet and heard surrender, but silence is also the sound of a trap being armed. Then, 24 hours after Trump's declaration of war, the first move landed. Carney appeared at a press conference in Ottawa. Not the grand theatrical counterattack many expected, a 4-minute statement, measured and flat, delivered with the cadence of a central banker reading quarterly results. He announced immediate retaliatory tariffs, not mirroring Trump's 50%, but targeted with surgical precision at maximum political pain: bourbon, dairy, automotive components, agricultural products. Each tariff aimed at a swing state, a vulnerable industry, a donor base. The markets had already priced in retaliation. Analysts exhaled, standard tit for tat. And then Carney said a single sentence that changed everything. These tariffs are temporary. They are designed to expire the moment the United States returns to the negotiating table. But the structural changes we are announcing today are permanent. Permanent. That word landed like a depth charge. Everyone understands that tariffs are temporary. They go up, they come down. They are bargaining chips in a larger negotiation. But permanent structural changes are something categorically different. Permanent means the ground beneath you has shifted, and it is not shifting back. Carney announced that Canada had signed a comprehensive, critical mineral supply agreement with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. Not proposed, not under negotiation, signed. Effective immediately, the agreement locked 70% of Canada's rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, nickel, potash, and uranium, exports into non-American supply chains for a minimum of 15 years. 3 presidential terms. A generation of industrial planning. The implications were immediate and devastating. The United States depends on Canadian critical minerals for defense manufacturing, semiconductor production, electric vehicle battery supply chains, and advanced weapon systems. The F-35 program, Virginia-class submarines, missile defense arrays, all of them require materials that Canada supplies and that the United States has no domestic capacity to replace at scale. Those supply chains did not just get threatened, they got redirected permanently, not as retaliation for tariffs, as national policy. Washington expected tariffs. Tariffs are a response. What Carney delivered was a restructuring, and the difference between the two is the difference between a punch and an amputation. But here's what stopped analysts cold. When reporters asked Carney's trade minister when the minerals agreement had been negotiated, the answer arrived with quiet precision. The final signatures were applied yesterday. The negotiations had been ongoing for 11 months. 11 months. The agreement was being negotiated for nearly a year before Trump's declaration of war. It was not a response to the executive order. It was waiting for the executive order. Trump did not trigger the restructuring. Trump provided the justification for announcing it. The ground had already shifted permanently beneath Washington's feet. That was move 1. Move 2 landed 24 hours later. Carney appeared again, but this time not alone. He held a joint press conference with 4 other leaders: the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of the European Commission, and the Prime Minister of Japan. 5 leaders, 5 democracies, 5 economies representing 1.8 billion people and $38 trillion in combined GDP, a market larger than the United States of America. They announced the Democratic Economic Compact, a mutual trade acceleration framework fast-tracking tariff reduction among member nations, establishing common regulatory standards for technology, artificial intelligence, and digital commerce, creating shared infrastructure investment mechanisms, and including a mutual defense clause against what the founding document describes as unilateral economic coercion by any single nation. The clause does not name the United States. It does not need to. Every person on earth who read that sentence understood exactly who it targeted. The framework document was 340 pages long. 340 pages of legal text, regulatory alignment provisions, tariff schedules, dispute resolution mechanisms, governance structures, and implementation timelines. You do not write 340 pages in 48 hours. You do not negotiate 5-nation regulatory alignment over a weekend. This document had been drafted over 8 months. 17 rounds of revision. Every founding member had signed off on the principles before Trump ever picked up his pen. Trump's declaration of war did not provoke the Democratic Economic Compact, it activated it. Move 3 was the quietest of all. On the third day, there was no press conference, no joint appearance, no speech, just a 6-paragraph government press release issued at 6 in the morning Eastern Time. 4 announcements. First, Canada was formally redirecting 40% of its crude oil and liquefied natural gas exports to the Pacific, binding 15-year supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and India. Signed and countersigned. Second, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was now classified as critical national infrastructure, with accelerated construction authority and emergency financing from a consortium, including Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund and Singapore's GIC. Third, a new Pacific LNG terminal at Kitimat, British Columbia, had received full environmental approval, with the construction crews mobilizing within 30 days. Fourth, Canada was establishing an independent financial clearing system for energy transactions, built in partnership with European and Asian financial institutions, eliminating dependence on U.S. dollar-denominated settlement for Canadian resource exports. None of these were improvised in 72 hours. The supply agreements had been under negotiation in parallel with the critical minerals deal. The pipeline authorization had been drafted and reviewed by legal teams weeks before Trump's executive order. The financial clearing system had been under development with European central banks and Asian sovereign wealth funds for over a year. All of it was ready. All of it was waiting. All of it required exactly one thing to be announced, a crisis severe enough to justify radical restructuring to the Canadian public and to the world. Trump provided that crisis. Carney executed. The only public statement from the Prime Minister's office on day 3 was a single sentence issued through a press secretary. Canada's position is not a response to the United States. It is an investment in Canada's future. We wish the United States well. 6 words at the end. No anger, no defiance, no rhetoric, just finality. The way you speak to someone you have already moved past. Not the language of an adversary, the language of someone who has left the building and is not coming back. Now, let me show you what was actually happening underneath the surface. Because the version that played on cable news was not the story. The story was something far more calculated, far more cold-blooded, and far more consequential than a diplomatic counterpunch. Mark Carney took office knowing one thing with the certainty of a man who had spent his career inside the architecture of global financial systems. Canada's structural dependence on the American market was an existential vulnerability. 75% of Canadian exports flowing to a single nation. No modern economy survives that kind of concentration risk indefinitely. Any portfolio manager would call it catastrophic exposure. Any risk analyst would call it a time bomb. And Carney, who had run the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and then run the Bank of England through Brexit, understood this better than anyone alive. But structural diversification is not a policy you announce on a Tuesday. It requires political will, and political will requires a crisis. Canadians would not accept the short-term economic pain of restructuring. The transition cost, the uncertainty, the disruption to established industries, unless they believed the alternative was worse, As long as the U.S.-Canada relationship remained manageable, diversification would remain a think tank white paper and nothing more. Carney needed a crisis, not a manufactured one. A genuine one, provoked by genuine American overreach. He needed Washington to go so far, so aggressively, so irrationally, that the Canadian public would not only accept radical restructuring, they would demand it. So he did what central bankers do. He created the conditions and waited for the market to react. The tariff reciprocity that infuriated Trump over the preceding months, calculated provocation. The sovereignty rhetoric that the White House called disrespectful, deliberate escalation. The critical minerals leverage play that made Washington hawks furious, bait. Each Canadian action over the preceding year was calibrated to push Trump one step closer to maximum escalation. Because maximum escalation was the only scenario that gave Carney domestic political cover and international justification for the radical restructuring he had been planning since his first week in office. Trump did not walk into a trap. He charged into one. Because Carney understood something Trump never has. The loudest person in the room is the most predictable person in the room, and predictable opponents are the easiest to defeat. Warren Buffett was asked about the confrontation at a Berkshire Hathaway investors briefing in Omaha. He paused, removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly. The signature gesture that veteran Berkshire watchers have learned to recognize as the signal that something important is coming. And then he told a story. In September 2008, he said, I received a call from Goldman Sachs. They needed capital. The entire financial system was in panic. Everyone around me saw a crisis. I saw something different. I saw a buying opportunity that only exists when everyone else is in crisis. I invested $5 billion in Goldman Sachs that week, not because I was brave, because I was prepared. The investment thesis had been written before the crisis. The crisis was the trigger, not the idea. He paused again, longer this time. When I watched what happened between the United States and Canada this week, I saw the same pattern. One side was in crisis. The other side was prepared, and the prepared side executed. Then Buffett went further. The most valuable information an investor can have, he said, is the behavior pattern of the other side. If you know how someone will react under pressure, if you can predict their emotional response with confidence, then you don't need to control the situation. You just need to prepare for the situation they will create themselves. What I saw this week was a prime minister who understood his counterpart's behavior pattern perfectly. He knew the provocation would produce an escalation. He knew the escalation would produce a declaration. And he knew the declaration would produce the political cover he needed to restructure Canada's economic future. That is not luck. That is not reaction. That is systems thinking. And systems thinking is the most undervalued asset in any market. When asked about Berkshire's positioning, Buffett confirmed what the filing data had already suggested. Berkshire had been quietly increasing its Canadian resource exposure for 9 months. Energy, minerals, infrastructure. Greg Abel, Berkshire's Canadian-born CEO and Buffett's chosen successor, had been given expanded authority over energy and resource investments months earlier. The $381.6 billion cash reserve, the largest in Berkshire history, had seen significant allocations moving toward Canadian and European assets with corresponding reductions in U.S. exposed positions. Buffett did not start buying Canadian assets this week. He started 9 months ago, around the same time Carney's team began negotiating the critical minerals agreement. Around the same time, the Democratic Economic Compact framework was first drafted. Around the same time, the Pacific Energy Redirect was first discussed with Japanese and Korean counterparts. Either Warren Buffett is the luckiest investor who has ever lived, or he saw the same structural play that Carney was running and positioned his portfolio accordingly before the rest of the market understood what was happening. Buffett closed with this: there are two kinds of people in any market, those who react to events and those who create the conditions for events. The first group works very hard and usually breaks even. The second group builds Berkshire Hathaway, or apparently restructures a country's entire economy in 72 hours. I don't know Mark Carney personally, But I know a systems thinker when I see one, what he just did, using a predictable adversary's predictable behavior to justify a structural transformation that would not have been politically possible without a crisis. That is not diplomacy. That is capital allocation at a national scale. Now, let me tell you what America actually lost in those 72 hours. Because this is the part that most people, including most people inside the White House, still do not fully understand. The real damage is not the retaliatory tariffs on bourbon and dairy and auto parts. The real damage is not the stock market decline or the manufacturing disruptions or the agricultural pain. All of that is real. All of that hurts. But none of that is the wound that will not heal. The critical minerals agreements are 15-year contracts. Even if Trump rescinds the executive order tomorrow morning, Canada's rare earth, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and uranium exports are locked into European, Japanese, and Korean supply chains for a decade and a half. The Pentagon depends on those minerals for every advanced weapons platform in the American arsenal. There are no domestic alternatives at scale. Building domestic rare earth processing capacity takes 5 to 10 years and tens of billions of dollars. America's defense supply chain just developed a structural gap that cannot be closed on any presidential timeline. The energy redirect is infrastructure-based. You cannot unbuild a Pacific LNG terminal. You cannot unsign a 15-year supply agreement with Japan. The crude oil that fueled Midwest refineries, 67% of their feedstock, is being physically rerouted to Pacific ports. Midwest refineries are specifically configured for Canadian heavy crude. Switching to alternative sources requires years of retooling and billions in capital expenditure. In the interim, energy costs rise, refinery margins collapse, and energy-dependent manufacturing migrates to wherever the energy is cheaper, which is now Canada, not the American Midwest. The Democratic Economic Compact is not a trade deal. It is an institution. It has founding documents, governance structures, dispute resolution mechanisms, and an anti-coercion clause designed to outlast any single presidency. It represents a market of 1.8 billion people that has formally organized itself to function without the United States and the automotive supply chain. The most integrated manufacturing system in the world, where a single component crosses the U.S.-Canada border an average of 7 times before final assembly, does not bend at 50% tariffs. It shatters. GM has suspended 3 assembly plants: Flint, Michigan; Spring Hill, Tennessee; Wentzville, Missouri. 14,000 workers sent home. Every one of those plants is in a state that voted for Trump. Every one of those workers believed the tariffs would protect their jobs. And then there is the signal that every nation on earth received and is now processing. The United States just treated its closest ally, the nation it has shared a peaceful border with for over a century, the nation that has fought alongside it in every major conflict since the First World War, as an enemy. And that ally left permanently. The European Union is accelerating its own trade diversification. Japan, South Korea, and Australia, all founding members of the Democratic Economic Compact, are building institutional alternatives to American-led trade architecture in real time. NATO allies are privately reassessing the economic foundations of the alliance. And China says nothing. China does not need to say anything. Beijing could not have designed a better strategic outcome if it had spent a decade planning it. Washington spent 70 years building a global economic order centered on one premise: the United States is a reliable partner. In 72 hours, one executive order proved that reliability was conditional, and conditional reliability is no reliability at all. This story was never about Trump declaring war on Canada. Trump declares things every day. That is what he does. He escalates, he threatens, he performs. It is the only mode he knows. This story was about a central banker who understood with the cold clarity of someone who spent his career inside the architecture of global financial systems that Canada's dependence on a single market was a structural vulnerability that could only be broken by a crisis severe enough to justify radical transformation, and that the most reliable way to produce that crisis was to let the most predictable leader in the world do what predictable leaders always do: overreact. Carney did not respond to Trump's war. He used it. Every trade agreement, every energy redirect, every institutional framework, every financial clearing mechanism that Canada unveiled in 72 hours had been prepared in advance. Months of quiet negotiation, years of structural analysis. The work was done before the cameras turned on. The declaration of war was the launch code, nothing more. Trump governs by impulse. Carney governs by spreadsheet. One model produces dramatic television. The other model produces results. And the distance between the two, the gap between impulse and systems, between volume and preparation, between the man who gave a 22-minute speech and the man who issued a 6-paragraph press release, is the distance between declaring a war and winning one. The Democratic Economic Compact holds its first formal summit in 60 days. 5 nations, 1.8 billion people, $38 trillion in combined GDP. The United States will not be at the table. The Pacific energy terminals begin construction within 30 days. Once the first concrete is poured, the redirect becomes physically irreversible. The Pentagon's assessment of the critical minerals gap is due within weeks. 5 to 10 years to rebuild domestic capacity. No shortcuts, no alternatives. Trump thought he was punishing Canada. He was liberating it. Trump declared war on Canada. Canada had already won it. The 72 hours were just the reveal.